one in a sec. Just make sure that's all recording. Cool. Sweet. 3, 2, 1, go. Hello there, people and listeners of the Hungry Podcast. Today I'm beyond excited to welcome Ed Perry to the podcast. Ed is the co-founder of Cook. I'm pretty sure every single person listening to this is very aware of Cook and has probably demolished a lot of Cook ready meals. They're absolutely insane. Cook has a turnover of 100 million, 1,600 employees, more than 90 of its own shops, more than 900 concessions and retailers, and has never actually entered a supermarket, which is fascinating, and we're definitely going to talk about that today. Cook exists to cook using the same ingredients and techniques you would at home, so everything looks and tastes homemade. Ed, as I was saying to you just before we hit the record button, I was demolishing your Dan noodles yesterday. They were so delicious. So thank you so much for coming on today. I'm really excited for this.
Great to be here, Dan. Thank you for inviting me. I've listened to a few of the podcasts and enjoyed it. So yeah, looking forward to the chat.
Happy days. So where I want to start is with drug addicts, alcoholics, and bakeries and baking cakes. It's a kind of a wonderful stark juxtaposition. And I think there's a kind of a deep, delicious kind of sweet spot of learnings there. But I read in a Guardian article that your parents had a bakery when you were kids, and it says, Mum would have waifs and strays for lunch on Sundays, and my parents would employ ex-drug addicts and alcoholics in the bakery. It would be a total shit show, but we grew up thinking that's what you should do. It's a values-based system. There's a lot to like about it. Now, you obviously now, through your Raw Talent program, employ and help people get back on the ground. But I want to go back to the kind of super early days with your kind of childhood. So how did working with, drug addicts, ex-alcoholics, homeless people as a kid provide you with an unfair advantage when you set up Cook as an adult?
So I'm the eldest of 4, and my parents had 2 small coffee shops, one in Tunbridge, one in Sevenoaks in Kent, and my mother's best friend baked cakes for the 2 coffee shops. And this was sort of early mid-80s, and so I grew up with my siblings working in the coffee shops during school holidays and all that sort of stuff. And the cakes that my mother's best friend used to make were amazing. And other coffee shops and caterers approached them and said, look, can you supply us? So in 1987, they set up a business called the Handmade Cake Company. And that was in Maidenhead. And Diana had previously worked in a drug rehab center. And one of the conditions for setting up the bakery proper to my parents was we need to employ people that come from the drug rehab center. And so that's what they did. And so right from the very early days, that I just grew up thinking doing that was entirely normal. That's what you do. And it seemed like a logical thing to do. And, very far from smooth, plain sailing. It was difficult, but, that spirit of what a business should be and could be was there from the very beginning. And so we were brought up in this sort of small business environment where we'd talk about sandwich fillings and cakes and customers and what was selling, what wasn't selling. They were way ahead of their time. Looking back on it now, they were way ahead of their time. They had a coffee roaster in the shop, and they were doing cappuccinos and espressos and stuff when outside of central London, nobody had heard of those things. So that's what we got brought up with: small food business, really focused on customers, really focused on food, and it was just a great way to get going.
It's so fascinating. It's kind of, we're going to get onto the B Corp stuff shortly, but you were kind of almost ahead of, your parents were ahead of the curve in terms of all the stuff that's now super important. I just want to go back to what we were saying about this unfair advantage. So is working with kind of, recovering drug addicts and homeless people, would you say that gave you more empathy as a kid, or what were some of the things you garnered from working with those people at that early age that I don't know, maybe set you up for success with leadership or, yeah?
I think looking back on it now, that there was a part that had something to do with it, maybe. But I think more than anything else, I think my parents were committed Christians, and they, Mum was always, well, both of them were always, inviting people around to the house for Sunday lunches and evening meals and stuff, and sort of taking care of other people. And whilst I don't share their faith now, I think the value system that we grew up with is, informed certainly my perspective now, and that of my sister Rosie, who's my co-CEO, James, my brother, who I run the business with for 7 years. We'll talk about him probably later in context of the B Corp movement. I think, there's a lot to like about the 10 Commandments, right? You don't have to have a Christian faith to go, yeah, there's, if as long as you're not a dick about it, it's that's a pretty good value set, really. I just think it was culturally the way they behaved, what they did by their actions, had a huge influence on how we think about business and how, I guess, we try and live, really.
No, it's so true. And I think it's almost like the commandments that from your parents of kind of the Christian faith installed. And I think whether you're religious or not, there's something in having those values, those hardcore values, right? The kind of in the foundations of the business that then work out how you do things properly. And I'd love to know how there was an article I read which was really fascinating, and you said the first 3 years had been, I think it was extremely, extremely difficult. Getting it going. I would love to know what those first 3 years look like, because I and lots of our listeners, I see concessions everywhere. There's one up the road. It's a huge multi-million-pound business now. But I'd love to kind of look at those first 3 years and what that looked like for you.
It was extremely hard. It's extremely hard at the moment as well. It always seems to be hard for different reasons. What I did is I after I left school, I didn't go to university, didn't want to go to university, just wanted to crack on and work. And I spent 4 years working for 4 or 5 years working for my parents' business, running one of the coffee shops, and then I was a salesman on the road, selling their cakes and puddings to other caterers and coffee shops around the south of England. But all the while my mother had always cooked for the freezer. And on a Saturday or Sunday, she'll cook a big batch of beef bourguignon or chili con carne or chicken casserole or something like that. And we'd eat some of it. And then what was left over, she would tip into an ice cream tub, old plastic square ice cream tub, and put it in the chest freezer we had at home. And then during the week, she would reheat that in the microwave. And it was always delicious. And I just thought, well, we've got these wonderful cakes and puddings that my parents are making. They were all frozen. They were different from what you could buy in the supermarket. And I figured that if we could make frozen casseroles that looked and tasted homemade, like their cakes and puddings, it could be something that would work on the high street. So I originally spoke to my parents about it, and they'd had a long, hard slog trying to make the coffee shops and the bakery to earn a living out of it. It'd been really, really tough. And I said, look, I really want to do these frozen casseroles. I think, there could be something in this. And they said to me, look, we get it, but we don't know anything about making frozen meals. And, if you really want to do this, you need to go and do it yourself. And I still vividly remember that conversation because I was surprised they said that, because I thought ultimately they would do it. But as soon as they said that, I knew it was the right thing. I just knew it was the right thing to do, that actually, yes, I did need to leave the family business and go and do it myself. So that's what I did. And I teamed up with a guy called Dale, who was a chef who I got to know, who was a customer of mine, who I sold cakes to. And he ran a tourist attraction, a big coffee shop in a tourist attraction called Whitbread Hop Farm in Kent. And I had spoken to him for about a year about this idea. And he's the only chef I'd ever spoken to, and we just clicked. I sort of fell in love with him from a business perspective, and happily he fell out with his boss at the same time as I wanted to do it. I was 25 at the time, and we borrowed £22,000 off a bank, and my parents lent us £8,000, so we had 30 grand in total to set up a manufacturing business and a retail business. And even 25 years ago, I look back at it now, it's just just stupidly small amount. You cannot do you just can't do that. And the only reason we were able to do that was because I completely lucked out with Dale. He was just a genius on every level, and he managed to get a production kitchen to make frozen ready meals up and running. With 18 grand, he found a disused pizza delivery unit, which had extraction and stuff like that. And he bought some secondhand equipment, which was all broken, but he wired it all up, some brat pans, and a stove, and we got going. And I found this tiny little shop in Farnham that was 250 square foot. I had a rent of 10 grand and fitted it out for 12 grand. And so, we were up and running, and right from the very beginning, D2C and all of that is, super trendy at the moment. And that's what it's all about. But it never occurred to us that we could supply the supermarkets. It was just, right, if we want to make frozen meals, we're going to have to sell them ourselves. There was no great sort of business insight or anything. It was just, right, we're going to make stuff and we're going to sell ourselves and set up a shop. I knew about running shops from my parents' coffee shops, but it was so naive and unsophisticated looking back on it. But the difficult thing in those first 3 years, I worked in the Farnham shop 6 days a week, 3 years. I think I had 1 week's holiday in 3 years, something like that. And the difficult thing was making the food taste good, because I just assumed that from day one, Dale would be able to make it taste nice. I had a really clear idea of what I wanted it to taste like. But of course, as soon as he started making the food, the initial stuff was absolutely horrible. And I still have vivid memory of I was living in a flat in Clapham and getting this first meal back. It was a lentil and fennel bake, and which doesn't sound very good, and it wasn't. It was just this sort of black gruel. And I remember it coming out of the oven expecting something wonderful, and it was completely inedible. And I had this moment where I just realised in that moment that what we were setting out to do was going to be incredibly hard. It just hadn't occurred to me before that it would be difficult making this food. And it just occurred to me, it's going to be incredibly hard, because if this was easy to do, everyone would be doing it. But of course, you couldn't buy this kind of food anywhere. The sort of quality of ready meals, and particularly frozen meals, was virtually inedible at that time, back in '96. So those first 3 years were about hanging in there, turning up every day. The first week we opened, we took £1,059 in the shop. So that, you have sort of 2 hours or 3 hours between customers coming in, which leaves a lot of time in your own head thinking, what on earth have we done here? But those first 3 years were about Dale figuring out actually how to make the product taste nice. Fortunately, we had my parents' cakes and puddings, which did taste nice. That sort of kept us going. That kept customers sort of coming and going, oh, this looks interesting. I'll buy one of those. And we would have, a few customers come and try one. Often they wouldn't come back because the quality wasn't good enough. And so it was all about him figuring out how to make food taste nice and just keeping going. And the good thing is when, I was 25, 26, you don't have many overheads. You can live off nothing. And that's what we had to do. So it was just about coming in every day. I was obsessed with the sales numbers. I'm still obsessed with the sales numbers. But every day and each week, trying to take a tiny bit more than you took the week before. And then the next week, you try and take a tiny bit more than you took the week before. So it was just keeping going. But there were enough people. The thing that kept me going those first 3 years was, whilst there was precisely no financial evidence that this would work, there were enough people, because I was in the shop talking to customers, there were enough people saying, oh, this is a good idea. They generally and often wouldn't come back, but they were at least saying it was a good idea. So I kind of knew that if we could execute it, then it could work. So I never stopped believing in the idea, even though the execution was hopeless to start off with.
There's there's so much in that, mate, and I think there'll be so much for our listeners. And a lot of our listeners are on that first 3-year journey, and I've heard so many people refer to it as the trough of sorrow, whereby you've got some of the things you said there of just hang on in. It's meant to be hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. And I think there's just so much in that for our listeners, and also kind of how. I interviewed Camilla Barnard, who's the founder of Rude Health, and she told me this really interesting thing. And she said there was no strategy; it was serendipity over strategy. So just kind of things will come together. So like you meeting Dale, him by happenstance, losing his job, and I think it's really reassuring for our listeners to know that there was, not to say there was no grand plan, but it was just taking each step at a time. And I think there's real kind of reassurance in that. And so you said, okay, so you're in your flat in Clapham, you're trying this meal, and it's not that delicious. It's not the wow factor. Just for some context, like, was there a ready meal like market per se, or was it like all just supermarket own brand, or was this like a very new nascent concept at the time? I'm trying to get my head around what it was like back in the 87, 90s.
Yeah, there was nothing really. I say there was nothing. There was M&S, of course. M&S had pioneered the ready meal.
Right.
And the supermarkets, I think in the late 90s, the supermarkets always did ready meals, and then they introduced their premium brands. But there certainly wasn't an independent sort of ready meal brand. Charlie Bigham obviously started about the same time as us, and he started doing his meal kits, which is a slightly different thing, but that was the only other brand around at the time. So yeah, it was certainly a new thing. Looking back on it, yeah, didn't feel it at the time, but yeah, it was definitely new.
And what steps were you taking to like improve the product? Were you like testing it with consumers in the store to get feedback? Because I think there's this whole thing of product market fit. So once you've got the product and it tastes amazing, then you can go. But I think lots of our listeners want to put a brand or a product in sexy packaging, looks great on shelf, but if you go home and taste it, you're not going to go back and buy it again, right? So it's all that repeat. So I'd love to know how you navigated those waters.
Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, this was the big challenge from the beginning. It's still the big challenge now. And there's various ways you can sort of look at it. One, I'm a bigger believer in, there's about 5 of us in the business whose opinions I really, really trust as to whether a product's okay or it's not okay. And those are the people who make the decisions. And we favor doing that internally rather than doing lots of market research. That's not to say it's the right way. That's just the way we've chosen to do it. I know Pret, for example, who we have pretty close relationship, took that approach over many years as well in developing products. Just get the people whose judgment and whose taste buds you really trust to make sure that the product's right. And as far as testing is concerned, I think one of the most important things that we brought in right in the early days, right at the very beginning, was we would have a taste panel where we would freeze down a single portion of every single batch we made and then reheat it, and just to make sure it tasted okay. And we still do that now. We now make something like, each batch of food we make is something like 1,500 to 2,000 portions, but we will still freeze down a single portion of every single product we make, and then a panel will taste it just to make sure it's okay and nothing is going to the customer that isn't okay. And I think that whilst a lot of food companies put in place technical processes to monitor quality, et cetera, there's nothing like tasting every batch every time. And I think you simply, when you're working with food, you cannot take quality for granted. And it amazes me how many companies do. And I think it's particularly dangerous when you outsource your production, of which, of course, many brands do, and just assume that everything is always going to be okay. Things go wrong all the time. And I think there has to be a really healthy paranoia when it comes to your product about just because you've made something, for 2 years, 5 years, or however long it doesn't mean to say it's still going to be okay. Stuff goes wrong because if you're dealing with fresh ingredients and fresh human beings who make the stuff, things go wrong. So I think just constant paranoia about that product, about how it's going to go out.
That's so fascinating. And I'll be very honest, like when I came in to start doing this podcast, I always just thought it's all about the brand and the packaging that needs to look really, really strong. And you'll get the kind of the pull through and people buying brands. I think there's actually a massive difference between people who want to set up a brand and people who want to set up a great food product that has a great brand as well. And I've interviewed Mark Palmer who was the Pret a Manger marketing director. He said we used to see ingredients as part of the marketing budget. Like that's how important was the quality of the product. Same with Charlie Bigham. Like he's been on here. They've got an obsession with the product, and I think it's really reassuring for our listeners. It's like the brands and the bells and whistles can come, but the foundations of the product need to be there first. What I want to talk about now, Ed, is saying no. Because I think some of the best brands define themselves by what they actually say no to, versus what they say yes to. So I don't know if you've heard of those Whoop watch things. I was listening to a podcast about those guys, and they basically absolutely smashed Apple and Strava to smithereens. And what he was saying on this podcast, listening to, is like we actually say no. So lots of our customers have said, can it tell the time? He says, no, we don't want to do that. And by saying no, it allows you to focus on what you're really good at. Why did you guys say no to the supermarkets? Fascinating question.
So it started so I ran the business for the first 3 years. It was me and Dale. And then in 2000, my brother James came on board, and he'd been at Cadbury's for 5 years, 6 years. He did 5 years, I think. He did the graduate marketing program in the mid 90s, and he did really well there. But he joined me and Dale, and one of the first things he said to me was the thing I like about what Cook is that you're making food and you're selling it yourself. I have spent 5 years having shit kicked out of me by supermarkets, and I was working for Cadbury's. So what chance tiny little Cook will have if it goes to a supermarket? We'll just have the shit kicked out of us, even worse. I don't want to do that. And I was like, okay, that's okay, fine. We'll do it ourselves. So he definitely had a huge influence on that. And we were always cognizant of the fact that if we went into the supermarkets, we always use the phrase, we'll end up working for them to some extent. And I guess we had this option of, we had these shops, and actually we could do it ourselves. It would be very capital intensive, which it really is. We're making all the stuff ourselves. 94% of what we sell in our shops, we make ourselves. So we have to pay for shops, we have to pay for new kitchens and all the equipment and stuff that goes with it. So it is very capital intensive. But it does mean that we are in control of the relationship with our customer, and we're not, we're not subject to the whims of supermarkets, which I appreciate we're in a sort of privileged position. And also, we've been very tempted a few times. We've gone through multiple cash flow crises over the last 25 years, and we've come pretty close to doing it. But in the end, we've on balance, we've gone, you know what? I don't think we need to do this. And actually, it's better doing it in our own shops, and particularly through the concessions. As you said at the beginning, we've got 900 concessions, which is about 40% of our business now. And by not being in the supermarkets, we are able to offer the independent sector, farm shops, delis, some of the cooperatives, people like that. We can offer them a brand that offers differentiation from what's in the supermarket. So it enhances the value of what we're offering them by not being in the big supermarkets. So, look, there's nothing against supermarkets at all. It's just we've been able, just fortunately, to do it without them.
No, that's so interesting. I think it's it almost goes back to that point of you could be in thousands and thousands of stores, but if they're in the wrong locations where your customer isn't, it's kind of not pointless. But it's great. It's great for the ego. We're in gazillion supermarket stores, but if you're not in the right places, then you're not going to get the right customers. And back to the concessions, there's when I was at Manulife, I used to do a lot of sampling at the Budgeons in Islington. And the Cook concession there is insane. It's like a big, massive part of the store is Cook. Back to the paranoia piece, how do you ensure on the franchise level that there's almost a paranoia about, a positive paranoia about how the products are displayed and how people talk about Cook, et cetera, when you're not there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just one other thing about the supermarkets I'd say is that I think the other thing I didn't say was that I think it's very difficult to run a food business or a business that is where it's targeted in two different directions. You either have a business that's targeted for mass distribution via the supermarkets, and that can work really well, but trying to blend that with having your own shops and your own concessions and your own routes to market, I think that's very difficult because you're then having to be lots of different types of business. You're either one thing or another. And I think that's, in terms of choosing where you're going to sell your product, you've just got to be pretty clear what your preferred route to market is. To answer that question, how do you monitor the standards? Like you said, in our own shops, it's pretty easy. It's our own teams and stuff like that. In concessions, it's the key to us has always been we will only supply in our own freezers, our own chest freezers. So owning and controlling that point of sale bit means that we know how, we've always had a thing of we will never sell our product merchandise next to the Haagen-Dazs and the frozen peas. That's just not going to happen. If the Cook brand is going to trade from somebody else's space, then it has to be in our own point of sale materials, and there is no compromises on that. So we have had to, we've said no to some pretty good offers from retailers where they wanted to put us in upright freezers or whatever it might be, and it's just no. We've got a really clear red line. If stuff is going in, it goes into our own freezers. So at least then we know the product is merchandised in a way that we feel comfortable with. So we're quite controlling like that. And I think probably we were lucky that the concession part of the business started in about 2005-06. We've got a brilliant guy called Chris Portwood who started it at that time for us. He's still with us. He's our sales director, and he's done an absolutely brilliant job. And we were just lucky we had the right setup at the right time to be able to get into retailers.
No, it's so, I'm kind of just connecting the dots here because, at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about your parents' kind of Christian commandments. And I think what if we extrapolate it out, you've got these really stringent but positive kind of commandments with how you do business. And I think, the ability to say no, it's very brave. Obviously, now looking at it, 100 million, it makes total sense. But I think for our listeners, even if you are a small challenger brand, you can say no to things if it doesn't feel right and reflect well with that brand, if that makes sense, or with your brand. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you might be being generous. You could say we're just terribly controlling. Yeah, we're a bit controlling and a bit. I don't know. We've just always had a clear view of how we wanted it to be. Yeah, but yeah, God knows we've cocked things up so much along the way, and still do. Still do. Gosh, yeah. And just now at the moment, just thinking about actually the people who are listening to this, I was thinking I had a bit of a sleepless night last night, actually thinking about some of the problems we've got in the business, and it never feels easy. You know, I'm in my 26th year of doing this. And I don't remember ever a time ever felt easy, and it feels particularly difficult at the moment. And I think, you know, we're as you said, we're a 100 million business and well established, and we know what we're doing, and yet it's really, really hard at the moment. Although we almost went bust back in 2008 when we grew too fast, and then the financial crisis happened. I think the actual trading conditions at the moment are the most difficult I've seen in 26 years. You know, consumer demand going down for obvious reason, and then this crazy inflation that's coming in. It's really hard to make any profit at the moment. It's really hard. And so, yeah, I feel, you know, a huge amount of empathy for all those other food businesses out there at the moment, trying to navigate the next 12 months, because it's really tough. It really is, even for sort of bigger, more established businesses like ours. I think everyone's going to go through a lot of pain in the next 12 months.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to know, because I was going to talk about this actually, but I'd love to know, I suppose, what was keeping you awake specifically last night is the first question. And then second question is how, when you're leading a team of thousands of employees, how do you, Ed, keep a calm and brave and stoic face in adversity? Because again, lots of our listeners will be managing teams where things are going Pete Tong right now, where they are going to have to be stoic. And I'd love to know, how you do it.
I think if you ask my team, they'd say I don't. But I do try.
At least you're honest.
God, yeah, they'd say, "Oh God, no! What are you talking about? You don't at all." But I do try. I think one of the things about leadership that I've sort of, real work in progress, but I'm sort of learning, is that, the mood and the tone that you set as the leader really does filter down. And so you come into the office full of angst about X, Y, and Z. It permeates down, and it's not fair on the people that work for you. And so you have to try, and I do emphasize try, because I fail often to contain my emotions and just be a bit, just not indulge my own mood and my own anxiety and stuff. I'm very fortunate that, because I run the business with my sister Rosie, who's a much, much better CEO than I am, and she organises most things. And if you ask anybody at Cook who actually runs a business, they would say, "Oh, Rosie runs a business," and Ed floats around getting cross about things. But I have her to exercise my angst on, and I try not to do it too much on everyone else. But you do have to be calm in times like this. And in answer to your question about what was keeping me up last night, it's an old-fashioned we've got a challenge in one of our teams at the moment. Somebody left, and it's how to make sure that team is well directed, and that people know where they're going. And it's the stuff that happens all the time in a business. Things just aren't quite right, and the solution isn't obvious. That's the thing. Usually, if the solution is obvious, you go, right, I know what to do. We'll do X, Y, and Z, and you crack on and do it. But it's not always clear, and we're in a position at the moment where, in a certain part of the business, we're not quite clear what to do next. And so it's like, okay, it's 3:00 in the morning, and I don't know what to do next. But it will be okay. We'll figure it out. That was last night.
No, and thank you for being so candid. And I just think it's so reassuring for me personally, because it's like, I worry about everything, and I'm a super emotionally driven person. So I'm not the best at containing my emotions. And I know so many of our listeners will be struggling and thinking about things, but it's just so reassuring with someone who's got to your level, still has these issues, so it doesn't go away. It's almost just accepting that it is hard, as we were saying. And if it was easy, everyone would bloody do it. So there's real value in accepting it's hard.
I think that's it. I think if you're going to run a business, I heard something on a podcast a few months ago that really resonated with me, which was there's a sort of 80-20 rule. If you're going to run a business, 80% of your business will be okay, will be going well to varying degrees. But the reality is, if you're running a business, you're likely to exist in the 20% all the time. The 20% of your business that's not right, that needs to be sorted out. And you just kind of have to accept that actually your working life is going to be spent largely in that 20%. And as I said at the beginning, it always has felt difficult. It feels difficult now. And although I can sort of sometimes, very occasionally, sort of take a step back and sort of look at things and go, gosh, we've done all right, haven't we? Most of the time, I don't feel like that at all. I feel just, this isn't right. This isn't right. This isn't right. And I think the moment that I don't feel like that will probably be the moment that I know I need to sort of step aside and go and do something else and let better people get on with it. But I think as long as I'm motivated and still up at 3 a.m. worrying about X, Y, and Z, then I've probably got a job to do. But it is the nature of doing it. You always think, if we could get to this point or that point, everything's going to feel okay. And I think the truth is you never quite get there. Though my sister would say I'm absolutely rubbish at celebrating and enjoying the successes we do, and I think it's so important for a business to enjoy and celebrate successes when they happen. It's a vital part of it. But yeah, I find it quite difficult, if I'm honest.
And literally, the person I interviewed last week, Sam Wiggin, was telling me about that, because I'm the same. I'm like, I need the next thing, the next guest on the podcast, the next. It's never enough. Just keep more, and I have to really reframe it with myself and just be proud of the fact you're doing what you want to do. That's, I think it's really reassuring for our listeners. And I'd love to know, and this is a question I ask all guests. There's this book called The Obstacle is the Way, by a guy called Ryan Holiday, really interesting book. And it's all about kind of stoicism and how in every obstacle lies a magnificent opportunity, albeit retrospectively. I would love to know, on your kind of 26-year journey, what has been the hardest obstacle which has kept you maybe not even awake at night, maybe crying at night, that's that point, that retrospectively actually paved the way forward?
Well, I mentioned it briefly earlier. It would be the financial crisis of 2008. That was, we'd been going for 10 years at that point. We'd borrowed a huge amount of money off the bank to build a big new kitchen and open 12 shops, within a year. And that happened, that coincided exactly with the financial crisis. So we found ourselves still as a relatively small business. I think at that point we got to a turnover of about 5 million, and we were losing about 200 grand a year, something like that, 250 grand a year. But we'd managed to borrow 4.5 million off the bank. These were the days of the early 2000s where the banks were just lending any kind of crazy amount of money to ridiculous companies like ours. So we borrowed this ridiculous amount of money. Financial crisis happened and sales fell off a cliff. We dropped about 20% in 3 months, and we realized that if we didn't do something radical, that we'd be out of business. The financial crisis was October 2008, and we realized by Christmas, if we didn't do something radical, we'd be out of business by March. And that was as bleak could be, because the sales in the shops were terrible. We had all this debt. It was like, how on earth do we get through this? And we did a couple of things. We did 3 things. One was we opened the door to franchising. That was not something I'd ever wanted to do before, but we ended up opening about 30 franchise shops in about 3 years. So we did a really good job with that. Franchising working really well for us because other people put up the capital for the shops, whilst we had this big kitchen to supply them. So whilst I never liked the idea of franchising, it was financially necessary for us to do so. And we closed the door to franchising in about 2013 once we were financially secure. But actually, that did a really good job for us. And we've still got, I think we've got 14 franchisees left who own about 28, 29 shops between them. And they've been fantastic for us. And it's been a really good thing. We started our concession business.
Sorry to interrupt. So they're different from the concessions. How? In that the concessions are different stores? Sorry, I'm just a little, just getting clarity on that.
So the franchise shop. So
how are they different?
A normal shop. So it's a normal cook shop, but it's owned by a franchisee who has paid for the shop fit, basically, and who operated the shop themselves.
With you.
So it's a full shop. So of our 94 shops now, about 29, 30 are franchises, that's the legacy from the 2008 crisis. So we did a good job with that. We accelerated the concession business as well, which was just getting going at that stage. So we needed to grow in a capital light way, because we couldn't afford to open our own shop. So concessions were really good for that. And that worked really well. And then the other good decision we made at the time was, although we were absolutely on our knees financially, really on our knees, bailiffs coming around the kitchen and all that sort of stuff. The vultures were circling because we'd been around long enough for people to be interested in what we were doing. And so we had offers of investment on the table, and which would have made our pain go away. But we also knew that there was a danger that could risk our ability to run the business in a way that we would want to do in the long term. And we always had a long-term perspective on Cook and what we wanted it to be. It was sorely tempting. I kept on having to almost slap my wrist metaphorically from grabbing the money that was on the table to make the pain go away. But we didn't take the money. And it meant that we had to suffer for another 2 or 3 years. It wasn't really until about 2011, 2012 that we could look at the business and go, yeah, I think we're okay. We're going to be fine. And it extended the pain. But, now we look at that decision that we made now. And so grateful we made that decision, because we're obviously still free, independent, and can run the business without anybody on our back, basically. But yeah, it was really,
and no, for sure. And I suppose, as you said earlier, like what was keeping you awake last night was that we're going into a really hard period now. So from the pain in 2008 and that suffering and almost being dragged through that, well, as they say, the trough of sorrow, how are you going to navigate this next period of potentially suffering, and what have you learned from that previous experience?
How are we going to get through this next bit? I think staying calm. So whilst I can get quite emotional, I'm really, I'm still as passionate about the business as ever. I think staying as calm as possible, reminding ourselves that we are, a successful business, and everything's going to be fine. So staying calm, getting really close to the detail. So one of the things, for example, I'm doing at the moment is, we're looking at where all the supermarket pricing is going. We look at that sort of, if not daily, certainly weekly, seeing what's changing, what we think is in the pipeline in terms of our own ingredient inflation. So we've had about 17% inflation in terms of packaging and ingredients coming in. We've passed through about 5 to 6% at the moment to customers. We have in our own business, where to price your product. That's not a science, it's an art. And, in our own business, we've got the hawks, who tend to be in the financial part of the business, and you have the doves, who are people like me, who hate passing on price and want to keep the prices as low as possible. So, and you have to just find probably the right balance that's somewhere in the middle. I'd much rather make a lot less profit than risk losing a customer, because I think once you lose a customer on price, it's incredibly difficult to get them back again. Incredibly difficult. So price up at, there's big risks involved in aggressive pricing. And so that's the thing that concerns me most, because actually at the moment our sales are really very good. It's our margin that's a problem. And so what I worry about is being too aggressive on price over the next sort of 6 months to pay for all the electricity and all the ingredients and stuff, and then losing customers as a consequence. I'd much rather take a longer term view, accept the lower profits and stuff, and retain our customers and keep our sales levels high. But it's a high wire act commercially. So I mean that's what I'm spending most of my time on at the moment, that sort of detail, and watching sales like a hawk.
What you said there, and it's really struck a chord with me, is pricing is an art, not a science. I'd love to go into that in a bit more detail. Like, why is pricing an art, not a science? Because I think, for me at least, and lots of our listeners, you do think, it's more scientific. You look at it through an Excel spreadsheet. This is our margins, blah, 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 blah. This is the volumes. But why would you say it's more of an art?
Because it's what the customer is prepared to pay. So it's as simple as that. Pricing and demand is determined by the customer. And so, we could say, for example, one of the debates / arguments we have in our business at the moment is, well, Marks and Spencer's have moved their lasagna to X pricing, or their cottage pie to X pricing. Therefore, we can charge X. And it's like, well, no, it's the customer. Our customers aren't walking into our shops thinking, well, Marks and Spencer's are charging X for lasagna. That's not how it works. It's what they're prepared to pay themselves. So, so I think if pricing is reduced to just, like you said, it's a spreadsheet, right? Well, here it is. It needs to be X. Now, of course, there is a financial requirement for a business to make a certain amount of money, or so, but you've got to be thinking all the time, well, is our customer prepared to pay that? And if our customer is not prepared to pay that, well, what are we going to do about it? What can we do? But I'm not pretending that I've got the answers here. All I know is that be really, really cautious about pricing, but equally be really, really cautious about product engineering as well, because that's what often happens. Because that's the sort of the triangulation. It's like, well, the customer won't pay more. We need to make some margin. Right, we're going to have to go back and engineer the product. Well, really be bloody careful about that, because that is where brands really screw up, cutting corners on this, cutting corners on that. One of the good decisions we made back in 2008 is we said, right, well, all cost comes out of the business. The only thing we won't compromise is the quality of ingredients coming through the door and the product itself. Because I think once you start doing that, you compromise the right to survive as a brand, because you're screwing with your customers. You're saying, well, I need to make my margins, so I'm going to give you less of the product or a poorer quality of the product. And that's what kills brands. So, but having to triangulate those three things, price, necessary financial performance, and product quality, really, really difficult. Really difficult.
It's so interesting. And what I interviewed Roger Wade, who's the founder of Box Park, and he very much sees this whole thing as an art, not a science. And he said, the shopper and the consumer doesn't walk round with an Excel spreadsheet, like making decisions. They just walk into a store. But whereas brands, or at least from the brand side of things, is you'll be saying, okay, what's our price in Tesco versus Sainsbury's versus Waitrose, or like direct or D2C? And you almost get put in this thing which is like almost like a brand bubble. And the more you get caught in your own brand bubble, the less time you're spending with the consumer, the less time you're realizing. And I think one of the trepidations can be if you spend too much time in your brand bubble and not enough time with your end consumer. Yeah, that's so I love doing these. I learn so much kind of live, but yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. Seeing pricing as an art, not a science. Where I want to go, and kind of sticking on this art versus science, is as I read an article and it says, well, two things. It says every year for the last 9 years, Cook has featured in the top 100 best companies to work for list. In 2021, we were ranked #1 food and drink company to work for. And then I think it was a Guardian article. You said there's a large sign on the wall of the office that says "Culture eats strategy." I was going to say for breakfast, but not for breakfast. It just eats strategy. I'd love to know. I think there's this really culture is really interesting. It's kind of a bit like almost like decorating a Christmas tree. In that, I think on LinkedIn, on social media, people are mistaking the decorations, i.e. the razzle dazzle, the things that makes it sparkle, i.e. the decorations. So I don't know whether it's beers on a Friday or working from home a few days a week. These are like the decorations you put on top of the tree, but the real culture is built through years of like nurturing and really going deep into the grounds. I think that's where culture comes from. And I think where we're potentially going wrong is we're focusing on the decorations and not the actual tree. And I think if we'd focused, what's the point of having delicious decorations if there's no bloody tree to hang on, right? I'd love to know how, and there's amazing perks, amazing decorations at Cook. How did you build that die-hard culture? Like, how did you nurture that?
So the first thing to say is I have been very fortunate to work alongside my sister Rosie, who's run the business alongside me for the last 10 years. And I think she is probably, in fact, I'm pretty certain she is the best CEO at culture in the country in terms of how you do it. She's obsessed by it and has always been obsessed by it. So it's categorically not something I would have been able to do by myself. She is a culture genius. And so she's been the architect of it. And I suppose I'd say a couple of things. One is that culture you can only build it in an intentional way. It's like anything else. You have to plan it. You have to figure it out. And I couldn't agree with you more. The bells and whistles. If people think that they can hang bells and whistles or throw bells and whistles at the problem to create culture, they're totally kidding themselves. That's bullshit. The thing that underpins everything in a culture is the values of an organization. And values are things that most companies now make visible. And you can take values as seriously or as unseriously as you like. A lot of the time, it feels like a lot of the time in companies, values come out of a 2-day, people go away for 2 days and they sit around and they get pissed and they come up with and have a lovely time, come up with the values, come back, and then it gets sort of put in a drawer. And it's you got to figure out how do you make your values live and breathe in the business. And both Rosie and I see our primary roles as CEO as being the guardians and promoters of the values within our company. So the values are everything in Cook, and you only know values work in a business if people refer to them in sort of everyday conversations within the business. If people are not doing that, then your values aren't alive and well. And if your values aren't alive and well, then you have no foundations on which to build culture. It's values are the most important thing. So I think the other thing that helps build culture is, so there's values, there's try and measure it. So the Best Companies survey has been really good for us because whilst no survey is ever perfect, we think that remains the best way of measuring culture. Every year we do it. Every year we learn things that aren't quite right in the business that we didn't know about. People can run companies and kid themselves about their culture. They can think, because everyone's nice to the boss, they can think everything's okay, but actually beneath the surface is all sorts of resentment or pissed off about specific things, whatever it might be. So it really, really helps to actually measure it and actually take a survey each year and actually see where you are and get an objective empirical look at it, because culture can be measured. Whilst imperfect, it can be measured. So those big things. Try and measure it. Values for us anyway have been hugely important, and also just a real belief that we have in the business that at the end of the day we're making frozen food, right? And the only thing, there is no obvious barrier to entry doing what we're doing. No, there's nothing technical. We're still making small batch quantities and stuff. The only reason we've been able to grow and thrive is because of the people that work in the business. It really is. It's people really care about what they're doing, whether it's working in the shops or working in the kitchens, working in the office. People really care about the business. And it's just knowing that if that culture goes wrong, the business will soon go wrong. It's just a real belief in that. And I think you can't build culture without really believing that people are the most important thing in your business. And I think that sometimes companies will or leaders might pay lip service to that whilst not really believing it and thinking that actually, I don't know, we can get, we could replace a few people with a few sort of stars from somewhere else. And I never buy that. The people that you've got are probably as good as they need to be. People are capable of amazing things if they're given the right environment to grow and thrive. Replacing people all over the place is rarely the solution.
There's so much in that, Ed. I think the first thing is, and I completely agree, there's almost like these IKEA flatback values whereby people just go and, as you say, go and get pissed. They get a load of salacious values, they stick them on the wall and think Bob's your uncle. And that's just not the case. I also think that values is something you have to make mistakes for the values to become more ironclad. And by that I mean like, if by doing your report and saying, okay, so where have we been a little bit off, or where have we potentially let an employee down or an employee's left, and having those raw and honest conversations with yourself. But then you say, okay, that makes up this value more, that bolsters that value going forward. And I think it's a bit like, I don't know if you're a football fan, but Sir Alex Ferguson, when he started United, they were a shit show. They were awful. They're making a lot of mistakes, but from those mistakes, they strengthened their values, and then they became like one of the best teams in the world. They got obviously all the class 92 and et cetera, et cetera. I'd love to know maybe some of the early, or just mistakes you've made that have then actually like not from a HR level, but yeah, just cultural mistakes you've made that have actually strengthened you retrospectively.
So a couple of things on sort of values and the mistakes. I mean, I'll actually just one specific example of something that brilliant idea by my sister, years ago now, that really helped strengthen the values in the business, was we do values recognition, where every quarter people within the business can recognize somebody else, ideally not in their own team, someone in another team who's helped them, or somebody they've recognized in their work through one of the values. So we have a system of recognition, and everyone gets a 2-portion meal or something who's nominated who's been nominated. And every quarter we have hundreds of values recognitions where people recognize other people, the work that other people do within the business through the values. And that's been a fantastic mechanism for embedding the values and making them real within the business. So that was just a specific example of something that's worked. In terms of the mistakes, as far as values are concerned, it's always people. And it's always been, the biggest mistakes have been, I think, hasn't happened that often, but when we've recruited, as we've grown a CV over a person, and I think, it's always recruit the person. Do we like the person? Do we think this person can work with the kind of values that we run at Cook, no matter how glittering the CV might be? And when we've ignored that, it's always gone wrong. And so it's just making sure that those people who come into the business feel right. Do they feel like your kind of people, regardless of what their experience might be? Because if they don't, then ultimately it's going to erode culture. They might be brilliant at this or brilliant at that, but it's impossible to build culture without like-minded, values-aligned people.
Mm. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about how pricing is an art, not a science, and almost hiring is an art, not a science, i.e. the science would be the CV and the art would be going by the gut intuition and the gut feeling of that person. And I think, and I've had guests on here before, and I've kind of seen it in many companies and kind of in our network of, I think sometimes you bring someone in like a big corporate person, and the reason it doesn't work is because it's not that person's not a great person and hasn't got loads of experience. It's because the values from the corporate learning to the startup learning are completely out of kilter. And then suddenly very, very quickly, the culture gets eviscerated. And I've seen that's happened to so many of our listeners and guests who've come on the podcast, say that. And it's really fascinating how the values kind of underpin everything. And so there's lots of our listeners, we always say is that there's getting from 0 to 1 million, which we've talked about, which those first 3 years, which was, hell on earth. Then you go to the sort of the 10 million stage, and lots of our listeners would, pine to get to that stage and may never get there. But then you've also got you at this now 100 million revenue stage, which lots of our listeners would be like, fuck me, like how do I get there? I'd love to know, from almost like a personal and a leadership lens, how you've had to change, as a person and evolve as the business has evolved at those specific stages. So I suppose how did the Ed have to change from going from sort of that first 1 million mark to the 10 million mark?
I think, I mean, the first thing to say, I feel very much like a work in progress, and I still get so many things wrong. And so it's, still very much a work in progress, but I think I've always really tried to learn from others in a very intentional way. So one of the things that served me enormously well is I've had 3 key mentors, and I got my first one back in 2000, who was with me for about 7 years. Then I had somebody else for about another 4 or 5 years, and I've had the last one for about the last 12 years. So that's not so not as in someone actually, on the board or anything like that. Actually, it's just somebody who I could go and talk to, a really experienced person. And so I found that enormously helpful. And always.
Who were these people? Sorry.
So the first guy had been on the board of Clark's Shoes. He got introduced to me by a friend of a friend. He was really good at retailing. The next guy had recently sold his cheese business, a big cheese business, a guy called Anthony Howson. And for the last 10 years or so, we've had a guy, Nick Candler, who was the COO at Pret for many years, who was part of their sort of the glory sort of growth run from about 2006, and he left in 2018, and he's been absolutely fantastic. So it's just finding the right mentor for your stage of growth. And I think that for me anyway, I looked at a business recently it was quite early stage, and they had about 4 people on their board. And I was thinking, why have you got 4 people on your board? You only need 1. Just get the right person. I think you can have too many advisors. Just get the right advisor to work with you. I think I've become quite good at, and I was always quite good at recognizing the gaps in what I couldn't do. And I think, it's really important to write all this stuff down and recognize the gaps. It's pretty obvious stuff, and recruit around that. I'm definitely less impulsive than I used to be. I think there's rarely a decision that can't wait for 24 hours. And it's amazing how much difference 24 hours can make in decision making once you've slept on it. The temptation to act on something that arrives in your inbox, oh, we've got to do something now, and everyone gets the knickers in a twist, and it's like, right, let's do this. Very rarely. And even, sometimes even after 24 hours, it's like, no, still not sure. I'll wait another 24 hours or another week. The temptation to dive into decision making and to be decisive as a leader is vastly overrated. I think, just wait. The truth often emerges rather than you having to make a decision. The truth can emerge. So I think becoming more patient in decision making has been a big thing. And I think as the business has got bigger, I've realized the biggest influence I can have is simply saying thank you to people a lot. Whether it's writing people cards or emails or letters, or actually going and talking to people and just asking people how they are. Just that kind of, I suppose, human leadership goes an awfully long way. Just trying to be nice to people goes an incredibly long way, I think. Because one of my things about business, the longer I do this, the more I think most of it isn't that complicated. This idea that you need super clever people to do this or super experienced people to do that. No, you don't. You just need people who are really committed, who are really values aligned and are prepared to work hard. And I think, and those people are everywhere. People make business more complicated than it needs to be often. It's not that simple. You're taking some input costs. You're trying to sell something to some customers. Think about the customer the whole time, but it doesn't need to be that complicated.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's so much in that, and I think lots of our so you had these three mentors on the three kind of the 0 to 1, the 10 1 to 10, and the 10 to 100 million ballpark. Lots of our listeners would do awful things to get access to those mentors. I'd love to kind of boil down their wisdom into sort of maybe 3 cook commandments, if we want to stick on the Christian kind of theme, that our listeners could implement immediately in their business. And I think what you said there, one which really struck a chord with me, is that the truth will always emerge. And that's, helps me because I'm so bloody impulsive. I'm just like bang, 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 bang. I'd love to know that.
Oh gosh, from the different, I struggled to sort of pick out what they were at the different times. I think one of the things, actually, the first guy, Patrick, really helped me with was we talked about the P&L account as being a statement of truth. And I think a lot of people have, particularly in early stages, have P&L accounts that are drawn up by accountants that don't obviously tell them exactly what's going on. And if you're running a business, you have to be close to the numbers and you have to be close to the P&L stuff and what have you. And make sure your P&L account really shows you really clearly exactly what's happening in the business. Don't use cost headings and stuff that are set up by an accountant. Make sure you draw up your own cost headings and draw up the P&L in a way and a shape that you can understand really easily. So it's got the right headings. So take ownership of your own P&L, basically. Don't let it be the finance department's or something somebody else has designed. You should design your own P&L account so it means something to you. I think another thing is around, I recently reread actually Jim Collins's book, Good to Great. I think I first read it about 10 years ago. And if anybody is sort of on that early stage in a business, you should definitely read that book. I think it's I've read quite a lot of business books, and for a purely business book, it's about the best book out there. The principles there, it's fantastic. And one of the things in there is about red flag mechanisms. And what red flag mechanisms do you have in your business that will tell you if something's going well or something's going badly? I talked earlier about the daily taste panel that we have in our business. That's a brilliant red flag mechanism to let us know if anything's quality is waning. The Best Company survey, again, is a fantastic red flag mechanism that tells us if something is going awry in culture in part of our business. So it's think about what your red flag mechanisms are. And if you don't have any obvious ones, you probably need them. Every company needs some red flag mechanisms. What else would there be? Let me think. Raising money. We have been in a position where we've been fortunate that whilst we don't have any private equity in the business, we have sold some shares over the years to pay for, houses and, kids and all of that sort of stuff. And we have been very, very careful to only get people involved, and we've been fortunate to be able to get sort of high net worth type people to come into the business to sort of provide some liquidity for us, to only get people who are values aligned. And I think making sure that you have got people coming into the business who are values aligned, that is hugely important if you're taking money. The biggest thing, of course, I should have said this before, the biggest thing I've learned from Nick actually over the last 10 years is in terms of how we run our annual cycle of business planning. So we've got a really clear structure that we've followed for about 10 years now, which we have borrowed shamelessly from Pret again, which is we have every July, we have our annual strategy meeting. And essentially, the strategy is something that we iterate every year. It's not something we reinvent each year. The strategy is the strategy. It's something that should take us forward 3 or 5 years. What sits at the heart of that is the purpose of the business, which is to nourish people and planet. That purpose has iterated over the years. It's gone through sort of several sort of semantic changes, but we're really happy with what sits in the middle of that. And then all of this sits on one page, the strategy. On the top half, we have our growth drivers. What are the 4 or 5 things that are going to grow the business? And on the bottom half of the page, we have the enablers. What are the 4 or 5 things that are going to enable us to deliver that growth? And we spend sort of 2 days each July looking at that one page thing, going, right, is this still right? Have we got the right growth drives in place? Have we got the right emphasis on growth? Then once we're happy with that, we go away, and about 3 months later, in October, just the senior team goes away with that one-page strategy, and we come up with a top 10 for the next year. And that top 10 will all be based on the headings that are on that strategy one-pager. Because I think where a lot of businesses, where we went wrong, certainly in our first 10 years, is getting distracted by shiny things. Oh, we could do this, or we could do that, without a proper strategic framework to keep us on the straight and narrow. So all of the top 10 things that we decide to do each year have to be under one of those strategic headings, whether it be an enabler, putting in a new IT system, for example, or a growth driver, which might be opening up a new sales channel like vending, which we're looking at the moment. But Nick was hugely helpful in creating that strategic framework for us.
That's so fascinating, because it kind of links back to what we were saying about the saying no. And I think it's so interesting how you force yourself to put your whole strategy, and I think this would be really interesting for our listeners, on one page. And it just shows when you've got one page, it forces you to say no to things and focus on things that actually move the needle. And I've been privy to it, and myself have come up with these pages that are just convoluted, just drivel, because people think more is more. And I think what I'm learning from you, Ed, is this ability to refine and say no to things. And we talked about it briefly earlier, the 80-20 principle. How do you ascertain whether something is a driver and isn't a shiny toy? Does that make sense? Because, even with this podcast, I'm thinking, right, fuck it, I want to launch like some clothing stuff, and I just know it's a massive distraction from what I should be doing. And I'm like, maybe I could just open a cafe. Like all these things come into my head, but I'd love to know how you work out what is actually a driver and an enabler.
It's a bit. So what springs to mind is, the old Simon Sinek thing, start with why.
Yeah.
have you read that? So it's, what is your why? Well, why does Dan exist? Why does Cook exist? And I think this idea of Cook exists to nourish people and planet, and then we're really clear that's what we're all about. We've got a really long-term horizon, and everything that we do as a business should support that central mission. And then if you're clear about that, then the sort of growth drives and enablers sort of come out of it pretty naturally. If you're not clear on what sits in the middle, then you won't have a sort of decent grounding on which to make those decisions. But I think and it's easy, I suppose it's easy for us to say, because we've been around quite a long time, is that it's important that strategy doesn't change the whole time. If you're constantly completely changing what your strategy is, it's difficult for everyone within the business. It's just, come on, where are we? And then iterate from that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's brilliant. And I think, again, just speaking to this, and I think a lot of people think, right, January's coming around, or whenever the year end is, right, we need to completely reinvent what that's got us from A to B to get from B to C. And I think there's merit for that sometimes, but sometimes it's just doubling down on what's working and kind of canning off what isn't. Where I want to go now, Ed, is, and this will kind of segue nicely into the B Corp stuff, but I was reading a book which is ironically very heavy. It's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's quite a philosophical book, and in that the author talks about how often our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. So, for example, like fossil fuels, categorically were an amazing strength in that, industrial revolution, loads of jobs, loads of prosperity, et cetera, but the kind of the shadow of that is that we've got, global warming, climate issues, et cetera. I would love to know kind of, firstly, is what would you say Cook's kind of greatest strength is as a business that could also be a weakness at the same time?
Oh, that's difficult. Greatest strength. I think we've always been completely consistent to our founding statement: cook using the same ingredients and techniques a good cook would use at home. Potentially that has limited how fast we can grow. Because I think also the fact that we haven't taken on any serious external capital and private equity, that's been an important principle. That again has probably meant that we haven't been able to grow as fast as we might have been able to grow. I think it's important to remember we're very fortunate that we play in a huge market. We're feeding people who have lunch or have supper each day. So it's a huge, huge market, and we could have grown quicker without those principles, but I'm happy we didn't. Some would probably say I'm the greatest strength and the greatest weakness. I had all the sort of motivation to get it going, but I often look and go, shit, am I actually the thing that really holds the business back from going faster and being better than it is? Because founders definitely can hang around too long. I want to go into that, Ed, because I think there's this, what you seem to have done so well outside looking in is you've managed to keep the founders of Magic alive as you've scaled over 26 years. That's a very admirable achievement. And I know loads of brands who, the founder either steps out, and you need to keep that magic alive as you scale. Otherwise you become quite just, I don't know, just not, there's no personality to your brand. But when you said you are the greatest strength and potentially the weakness of the business, like how do you think you slow it down? I'd love to know that. I suppose it's just, you go through the journey from 1 million to 10 million to 100 million, and pretty much the whole way through, you're thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. and you're making it up as you go along. And I definitely think that at the moment. And you just worry whether. I spoke to my sister a bit about this actually, and and one thing, I categorically could not do this job without her alongside me. There's no way I could be CEO of Cook by myself. I simply have not got the breadth of experience or skills to be able to do it. I'm not a very good manager at all. So I couldn't do it without her. But I sort of say to her, I think almost every year, couple of years, we should sort of think of the future in terms of, one, are we standing in the way of somebody better to take Cook onto the next stage? Two, can we still see the future? And when I say the future, I tend to have a 3-year horizon, no longer than that. Can I see what Cook needs to do in the next 3 years? And as long as I got a really clear idea of what we need to do in the next 3 years, I think, okay, I'm probably good to hang around. And as things stand at the moment, I can see what I think we need to do in the next 3 years. And obviously, am I still enjoying it? That's hugely important. So yeah, sort of keeping that decision always under review. I can't remember what you asked me before that. What was it? Sorry.
Well, it's just like no worries. It's how you're. You said I'm arguably the greatest strength and potentially the greatest weakness, and I just think it's interesting how that can be the case with keeping the founder's magic alive. And you said your sister's almost come in to keep your magic alive, but then parry away your weaknesses, if that makes sense, through the managerial lens. And I think for our listeners who are trying to go on that journey of scaling, it's like it's the riddle wrapped in the enigma. It's like, how do you keep the founder's magic alive as you scale? And, I interviewed Ben Branson from Seedlip, and he said we went through 3 CEOs to try and balance that out. It's like keeping the founder's magic, but getting the managerial, tendencies there to like keep it alive. So I think it's really interesting how you guys have done that. Conscious of your time, so just kind of a few more questions that I asked to all guests to kind of wrap up with, if that's okay. I would love to know in one sentence what you think a brand is.
A brand is how you make customers feel. So when customers think of Cook, I obviously want them to think. I want them to think that the food is good and it's somewhere they want to come back and buy their food from. But I want them to also think that they're buying into something that is more than just food. A product, a chicken pie that tastes nice. They're buying into something where they know and believe that the ingredients are sourced responsibly, that people are treated well, and that the company itself, to use the B Corp moniker, is a force for good in society and does the right thing. So it's all of those things. It's making them feel good about what they're spending their hard-earned money on.
And do you think, when you're working in that one store, I'm kind of going right back to the beginning of our conversation now, spending so much time with the customer, did you think that's given you an advantage to almost constantly know what they feel and think about your brand? It kind of goes back to this art versus science piece. Or is there a specific, i.e., is there a guttural feeling like this is what they're saying about the brand? Or is there like a scientific way you measure that?
No, I think it is just staying very close to the customers. Monday morning, the first thing I do is look at the complaints report each week, and who's complaining about which product. It's going around and going to the shops and talking to the shop managers, and the staff in the shops. What are people saying? How are you feeling about things? And it's just staying very, very close to the front end of the business all the time. And I really, really, really care about experience. I really care about when people have a bad experience. And, and it's, again, that's another sort of criteria for wanting to carry on. You just got to have that natural, you just got to really care. Really care.
The way I see it, you almost see your Cook as a retail brand, but you almost look at it through the lens of more like a restaurateur. Is what I'm getting. It's like that customer service is absolutely everything, and every touch point, and it's almost like a maniacal obsession, with what that customer feels. And I think there's a lot in that for our listeners. Is it's not every touch point has to be meticulously thought about. And say you do get a bad complaint about a product. What happens then? It's like, just out of curiosity, I find that interesting.
So, well, it all depends on the nature of the complaint, but obviously, there's a sort of, you've got to get back to them straight away. You never ever quibble about whether the complaint is justified or not justified. It's a hands up. It's always, we're in the wrong. We're in the wrong rather than you are mistaken. That's a golden rule. And always be generous, always be very, very generous. If people have taken the trouble to actually get in touch with you and complain, then always be enormously generous in how you respond.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm learning from you is this ability to distill things into its most basic form and realize the business isn't that complicated. It can be simple by just saying no to things and keeping it really simple. Final question. So, you've got kids, right? I'm right in saying.
Yeah, got 4.
Yeah. What advice do you impart onto your kids as they either embark or are embarking out on the world? I asked this to all guests who've got kids. I think it's an interesting lens.
Oh gosh, kids. They're hard work.
Sorry for going there on a Wednesday morning.
My eldest is 17 and my youngest is 7. So, one of the things I try and repeat, it's a bit like, so we've got our values in the business, and if I've got 3 personal values that I try to live by myself, and I've got it written up on a big. I'm working at home actually at the moment, and I've got written up on a big blackboard just to my right: be kind, be generous, tell the truth. And that's the sort of mantra I keep coming back to with them. And that's why I try and pass on to them. If you can be kind, be generous, tell the truth, and work hard. Whatever you do, then you'll probably be okay. But I'm not much more. That's about all I can offer them, really. And I think, one of the mistakes I think I made certainly in the first 15 years of the business, and I'm getting better at it now. I always used to think that if Cook got to £1 million turnover, then I'd be happy, and then I got to 1 million, it didn't quite work out. And then I thought, well, maybe it's 5 million and then 10 million. And so it went on. And I, finally sort of twigged that it really didn't matter what Cook did or didn't achieve. It wasn't going to make me feel okay. And I tied my own sense of self-worth far too much to my business. And only over the last sort of 5 years, I've sort of managed to sort of separate the two things. I'm still just as passionate about the business and stuff, but I've managed to sort of begin to separate my own self-worth from the performance of the business. And I think it's really easy when you're passionate about a business and you're just starting off and you think, well, if we can just make the business successful, then everything else is going to be okay. And it doesn't work like that. So I think, you just have to look after yourself and keep your own a sense of self separate from whether the business goes well or badly, because you need to be okay, because business is really hard. It's really hard, and it's always hard. And actually, you need to be okay in and of yourself without thinking the business is going to do that for you.
I mean, this literally reminds me of the conversation I had with Sam Wigan last week. He said to me, when is enough enough? And it's just really reassuring that speaking to you now who's at 100 million, and it's still, when is enough enough? And I suppose just quickly, how do you do that? How does Ed separate Ed as father, person, human being versus Ed as CEO of Cook, and not tie their self-esteem and worth to the ups and downs of the business? Like, how have you done that over the last 5 years?
A little bit of therapy.
Yeah.
That helped. Gosh, wish I'd done that earlier. Blimey, wish I'd done it when I was 25. That helped a bit. And I think the kids growing up, that helped. But I still struggle with it a bit, to be honest with you. And then I've got pretty good at daily disciplines. I'm really good at daily disciplines. I write a diary every morning, which grounds me, see, where I am. I have to swim every morning. That's really important. Need to take a walk outside every day. I found that really important. But I've got and I go to bed ridiculously early and I get up ridiculously early. And I found that works for me as well. It also turns out not drinking shitloads. That helps too. Though I missed that. So I've got a whole load of...
Have you stopped drinking then?
Not completely, but I used to drink quite a lot, but now I hardly drink anything. A few beers here or there, but not much at all. But yeah, running a fast growing business back in the day and, burning the candle at both ends, took its toll a little bit. And I think, you have to, if you're working really hard, you've got to, I certainly, looking back on it, didn't manage my lifestyle very well. I have to say I enjoyed burning the candle at both ends, but once you get into your 40s, it begins to take its toll. So yeah, I just a lot of daily disciplines. Really, that sort of keeps me in check. My sister keeps me in check as well.
And yeah, no. And what time? What time? So what time do you wake up? Because I mean, I'm very militant with my morning routine as well. I could badger on about that. But like, what time do you wake up and then? Like, what does that look like, your first hour of the morning or so?
Oh, God, well, I'm going to sound like a total weirdo because I get up at about 3:45 and 3:45, 4 o'clock.
Fuck, what time do you go to bed?
About 8:30, 8:45. I sort of get 7 hours. I go to bed really early. And it just works for me. I'm really good early in the mornings. Unfortunately, nobody ever sees me when I'm at my best. I sort of peak at about 4:30 in the morning, and then it's sort of managing the gradual decline from there. But yeah, no. So early mornings are all about doing some diary writing. I'll do sort of 45 minutes of email, and then I'll go swimming, and then I'll be in the office by about 7:15. And yeah, that's how it works.
It's just inspiring me to wake up earlier. Look, Ed, I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. Learned so much. I think a big thing is, a lot for our listeners is the ability to say no to things that don't feel right. I think the ability to start seeing things, whether it's pricing, hiring, as more of an art versus a science, and also for me personally, realizing that it's hard now, it's going to be hard in 10 years, it's going to be hard in 20 years. So kind of just try to enjoy it and separate your worth from it. But look, thoroughly enjoyed that.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Really enjoyed talking to you.
So I'm just going to hit